We begin with some breaking news at this hour. The White House, President Trump has just announced a 10-day ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. So let's get to the White House and CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang. So Weijia, what more can you tell us about this ceasefire?
Well, the president just announced this and said it will last for 10 days. Beginning at 5 p.m. Eastern. And the president said that he has directed the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, the vice president, and others to help broker a permanent peace deal between Lebanon and Israel. Now, remember, the reason why we have seen an escalation in fighting is because there was another ceasefire agreement that the president announced about a week ago for the broader war, the Iran war. And after that, Israel and Iranian-backed Hezbollah, based in Lebanon, continued to trade strikes. And while Lebanon said they were supposed to be part of that broader ceasefire agreement, Israel and the U.S. Disagreed with that. And that's why the fighting there continued. However, this ceasefire announcement today brings that fighting to an end for at least the next 10 days. As all parties try to negotiate a permanent deal. The president mentioning in his post that this is the first time in a long time that these two countries have had meaningful talks since 1983. He says that he's also invited the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of Lebanon here to the White House, although he did not specify when that would happen. So, this is important for not only these two countries, but also in the broader context as the president tries to end the war in Iran.
Yeah, and Weijia, speaking of the war in Iran, we know a delegation from Pakistan is now in Iran for a second day of talks. But do we know when the U.S. will be back at the negotiating table?
Well, the president expressed optimism about this earlier this week. He said that, something could be happening in terms of a second round of direct negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, but we don't have a date on the books. And just yesterday, his White House press secretary also said that they are optimistic about reaching a deal, but there is not an official meeting on the books yet. However, there is engagement. There are other behind-the-scenes preparation talks going on because the president, is trying to find a diplomatic solution to the end of that conflict. But as you mentioned here at the top of your show, if that does not happen, they are also very clear that this is not going to be a good situation for Iran. The Pentagon Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth just said this morning, warning that Iran needs to make the right decision and come on board with the agreement that the U.S. has put in front of them. Otherwise, there would be consequences.
Okay. Weijia Jiang at the White House for us today. Thank you so much, and thank you for bringing us that breaking news. Now let's continue our coverage on the war in Iran. With the ceasefire set to expire in just days, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is warning Iran to not break it.
We are locked and loaded on your critical dual-use infrastructure, on your remaining power generation, and on your energy industry. We'd rather not have to do it, but we're ready to go at the command of our president and at the push of a button. If Iran chooses poorly, then they will have a blockade and bombs dropping on infrastructure, power, and energy.
All right, I am joined now by CBS News Pentagon reporter Eleanor Watson. Good to see you today, Ellie. So what are your takeaways from Secretary Hegseth's messaging earlier today?
The message from him that was a warning to Iran was accompanied by a message from Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane, who said that in addition to the blockade, Iran would face U.S. forces searching down, pursuing any Iranian-flagged vessel or any vessel attempting to provide support to Iran, no matter where those vessels are in the world. And he specifically mentioned the Pacific. That's part of an effort that this blockade is part of to choke Iran's economy of any revenue it's been receiving, mostly through oil, during the conflict so far. General Kane on that blockade kind of laid out in maps where it's being enforced from, deep inside the Gulf of Oman. And according to the Pentagon, no vessels from Iranian ports have so far gotten past that net. Some have gotten through the strait, but not past the blockade itself. But that's only one part of the goal here. The other part is reopening that strait to other traffic that has not gone through because of the risk of Iranian attacks. Since the blockade took effect on Monday, over 20 ships have made it through, but that's down from about 138 per day before the conflict began.
Wow, yeah, that is a huge difference. So earlier today at that same Pentagon briefing, General Dan Kane laid out how the U.S. military is enforcing his blockade. So let's listen into what he had to say.
Let me be clear. This blockade applies to all ships, regardless of nationality, heading into or from Iranian ports. The U.S. action is a blockade of Iran's ports and coastline, not a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Enforcement will occur inside Iran's territorial seas and in international waters.
And so, Ellie, General Kane there says that the blockade is on all ships heading into or from Iranian port. What is your take on what General Kane revealed about the U.S. strategy on all this?
General Kane is kind of talking about the enforcement mechanisms the Navy would use. So far, they've only had to communicate to vessels. The vessels that have made it through the strait, there are about a dozen Navy warships down on that blockade line, and through transmissions, through communications, bridge-to-bridge radio, the Navy has warned those ships against trying to escape the blockade, and 14 have now turned around. If necessary, each of those warships have teams aboard who are trained in visiting, boarding, and seizing vessels if necessary. It hasn't come to that, and if needed to go further, there are also helicopters aboard those warships that could be used to interdict vessels from Iranian ports. We saw some of those helicopter interdictions that the Coast Guard did actually in the Caribbean against Venezuelan tankers as part of an economic campaign against Nicolas Maduro at that time, a campaign that President Trump is now trying to kind of recreate, but this time against Iran.
And Ellie, I just want to make sure I'm getting this correctly. So right now there's a blockade on all Iranian ports, correct? But on the other end, other ships still can't get through. Iran is also blocking other ships from getting through the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, the interesting thing there is the blockade is focused on ships from Iranian ports, because the concern is that while Iran has been what President Trump essentially said, he called it Iran holding the Strait of Hormuz hostage, Iran has been able to get its ships through. Other ships have not been able to get through. So this blockade is the first piece to stop Iran from being able to get its ships through. The second piece is assuring other ships that they are safe, that Iran would not attack them. Secretary Hegseth today warning Iran to make the right choices in negotiations and in where it's pointing its missiles, pointing its drones, pointing those risks. But so far, a lot of shipping companies are in a wait-and-see mode to see just how safe that strait is in this ceasefire.
So as of right now, I think the best way to say it is that everything is at a standstill. Iranian ports, they're blocked by the U.S., but then other ships still can't get through the Strait of Hormuz. Is that a good way to summarize that?
It is. They're starting to trickle through, but it's nowhere near the goal of reopening it back to pre-conflict.
I see. Okay. Ellie Watson, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.